Fáilte Arás go How to Be Irish with me, Una Herty. The purpose of this podcast is to take a snapshot of what it means to be Irish in today's world by examining different facets of Irish life through my guests' areas of interest and expertise. Many times now, the theme of nature, slowing down, and connection to the land have been coming up in this podcast. So this episode will delve into that topic on a deeper level with my guest Soil Boy. I hope that you buin tanamh as an episode seo. Soil Boy is a nature educator and content creator whose upbringing in the foothills of the Dublin Mountains brought an appreciation for the outdoors that has persisted throughout his life. His podcast, Feet on the Soil, covers a range of topics such as the importance of different habitats in Ireland and living a life in touch with the seasons. Soil Boy hopes to help people learn about the magic of nature so that we can start to think of ourselves not as people in nature, but as people who are a part of nature. Soil Boy, thank you so much for coming on to How to Be Irish today. How are you getting on?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me on. I'm very excited.
It's great to have another podcaster on as well. I'm so excited to talk to you about the land in relation to Ireland because it's been a topic that has come up an awful lot on this podcast. I find some guests who this isn't even really their area of expertise. It just kind of ends up gravitating towards that. So I'm looking forward to exploring that with you. But I want to start off by asking you about a bit of a kind of a hot topic and maybe a bit of a buzzword when it comes to these things. Biodiversity. Could you explain what biodiversity is and how it relates to Ireland?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, I think it's interesting what you were saying, how the people that you're talking to are innately bringing up the land. I think a lot of people in Ireland are very attached to like the geography of the place, like the physicality of it. But biodiversity is, it's like you said, it's a bit of a buzzword. It's a very all-encompassing term. It basically, it means the amount of different things in an area and living things. So plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, everything is encompassed in biodiversity. It's become a huge topic at the moment because alongside the climate crisis that we're obviously going through, we're going through a very, very severe biodiversity crisis. A lot of that is due to habitat loss. It's due to the way that we're kind of living our lives at the moment. But it's gotten to the point where now it's not something that scientists are pointing out as like this thing that's kind of happening in the background. It's very much affecting people's lives. It's noticeable in the everyday. The example that gets thrown out a lot of the times is this thing called shifting baseline syndrome. If you take when my dad was born in the late 60s, that's his baseline of the amount of nature in the world. So he always tells me that he was able to go for a drive from Dublin to Carlow, and when they got out of the car, they'd nearly have to wipe the window because there'd be that many insects on it. My baseline is being born in the early 2000s, and if I were to do that same drive, maybe there was one or two insects on the window. And then say the baseline for my younger cousin, 2010s, there's now nothing on the window. And that's only within the lifespan of 3 generations. So the baseline of biodiversity is shifting. The amount of living things is reducing.
And why has this happened? Like, that seems like a very dramatic change.
Yeah, I mean, the major thing is habitat loss. Ireland was never, in our memory, Ireland was never this bastion of wilderness. But in the past, Ireland would have been, I know it's a very famous thing that gets thrown around, but it would have been heavily forested to the point where a red squirrel could go from Dublin to Galway only along the treetops, or Meissen to Malin. Over years and years of occupation from different peoples, the forests were slowly cut down. The habitats that would have been the home to these animals would have been taken away. And specifically to insects in modern years, a lot of agriculture would have something to say for the drop in insect life. Now, I would be of the opinion that farmers do get a bit of the short straw in Ireland. We tend to push all of our blame onto the farming community when it might not be fully deserved. But this loss of habitat, both forests, but also peatlands, wetlands, grasslands, meadow, everything, it's all become this monoculture. If we're looking at it from a forestry perspective, it's the change from native broadleaf to Sitka spruce for proper production of timber. If we're looking at grasslands, it's the transfer from native grasslands, which were hugely diverse, kept down by herbivores and natural methods, to intensively overly fed and nutrient dense industrialized grasslands. And then with peatlands, we see that what was once this wetland filled with not a huge amount of biodiversity, in that there wasn't this vast amount of species that you'd find in a forest, but the things that were there were so specialized that these habitats really can't be replaced, and they were just drained and cut back for fuel over years and years. And then eventually again that became industrialized, and we see this biodiversity crisis now.
Particularly, I've heard about it in relation to the trees and how little, as you said, forest cover that we have compared to what we used to have. When did that really start to decline?
It's been a long history. I mean, the one thing that it's quite widely known in Ireland is that British occupation was a big factor in the decline in Irish forestry. The forest cover was brought down to, by the time the Irish state became a thing, I believe we were at just under 1% forest cover on the entire nation. We're now up to 11%. But as I previously mentioned, that 11% is mainly these Sitka spruce plantations. It's not native biodiverse broadleaf plantation, or not plantation, forestry. And a lot of this is due to previous occupation of the land. I will say people like to put the blame on to British occupation, and that is 100% warranted. But for the last 100 years, forestry has been owned by the Irish state, and the job that has been done to bring it back is maybe not perfect. So our forestry was vastly reduced by colonialization on the island, but it's now our responsibility to kind of pick it up and to bring it back.
Absolutely. So this 11%, this monoculture that we have now, would you say that's almost like worse than having so little that it's below 1%? Where would you kind of level it off at?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people do throw out like, oh, but sure, we've got that forestry now, like at least there's something there. The unfortunate thing about that is a lot of the areas that are Sitka spruce plantations now would have been seen as marginal lands. So land that farmers couldn't have used for crops, land that would have been maybe a little bit too undulating to put different animals on at risk of injury. But these lands were usually the things I was just talking about, the peatlands, the wetlands, the old style grasslands. And all of these are just either drained in the case of peatlands, cut back in the case of grasslands, and just replaced with these monocultures. And I always say to people, like, it's very easy to know when you're in one of these Sitka spruce plantations. The trees are in like these regimented lines. They're just as straight as they can go for as far as the eye can see. The ground has no diversity in it. In a real forest, in a native forest, you would have your canopy layer, your understory, your ground cover, and each distinct layer is filled with biodiversity. In a Sitka spruce plantation, it's just trees that go straight up to the sky and then straight out in a line. And it's really creepy. There's a lot of them in Wicklow, and you find yourself out hiking and you could be coming up a hill, and one moment you're in a very beautiful kind of pocket of native forestry. And then when you come into the Sitka spruce plantations, you're always kind of like checking over your shoulder. It's a bit spooky. The lands that used to be there before the Sitka spruce, it's night and day what they would have been for biodiversity. Of course, a kind of an apex habitat would have been the forest, but the peatlands, the grasslands, the wetlands, they're all just as important. And these are the areas that have been destroyed in the name of kind of timber production and forestry, quote unquote.
What an absolute shame. I mean, I'm kind of like just curious though, because why did they even bother planting all of these trees if they're not actually going to enhance biodiversity at all?
Everything in the climate crisis, in the biodiversity crisis, in nature in general, you have to look at it from the context of kind of development, or quote unquote development. So Ireland came into itself, it became a state, and it all of a sudden had to kind of fend for itself. So one thing that we did was we created this forestry body called Coillte, and they are, I believe, the largest landowner in the country now. So 9 times out of 10, if you're walking through one of those Sitka spruce plantations, it's owned by Coillte. So their job is to operate forestry as an industry. So the Sitka spruce plantations, they were never planted with the idea of, creating a beautiful home for red squirrels or for pine martens or for deer or for plants or for fungi. They were created with the intention of fast growing. In 30 years, you come in and you chop every single tree down, you chip them, you turn them into fuel, you send them off to different countries, whatever it might be. But the whole point is profit. Whereas some of the other organizations that are popping up, or individuals, you take like Owen Dalton in Beara, they are growing forestry for the purpose of biodiversity. And then there's other initiatives around the country that are going into forestry with this new kind of mindset. So there's things like continuous cover forestry, where you're getting your end product, you're getting timber, but you're also doing it in a way where biodiversity is benefited instead of negatively impacted. So we are learning, and we're trying to improve as a nation and as a planet. But you do kind of worry, is it a bit too little, too late? Because The old forests are already cut down.
Whatever effort that we are doing now should be really to enhance biodiversity, and it's a real shame that this state body is so responsible for this. Money is the main motivator, and money and nature, they shouldn't be in the same conversation. Like, it's a real shame. You mentioned a pine marten there. I actually have a pretty funny story about a pine marten. When I lived in Dublin city centre, this was a few years ago now, I was subletting off this girl just for the summer. She was away in a J1 or something like that. And she said, whatever you do, don't leave that window open, because there's a pine marten that lives in the roof of the building, kind of connected. It was kind of like perpendicular, let's say. And I was like, okay, grand. And like for the whole summer, I always closed the window before I like went out. I think it was the very last night that I was staying there, and was having a few friends over, kind of, a few drinks going out before I leave the place. And I forgot I left the window open and went out anyways. Came back a few hours later, and I realized that there was like this. I had like a few mandarins on the worktop. They had been like taken down and like ripped apart, and I was like, that's very weird. And I kind of didn't think about the pine marten in this instance.
Yeah.
And then I went into the bathroom, and there was like a very small puddle of wee right beside the toilet. And I was like, interesting, at least that it had the decency to go in the bathroom. Literally, not quite in the toilet, but in the bathroom. And then anyways, went to sleep. That was fine. And then, I probably must have been about half an hour later. My friend actually he was staying over. He was staying on the couch. And bear in mind, this couch is right below the window that I was warned to close.
The entrance.
Exactly, the famed entrance. And was asleep. And next minute, I just hear this boom, like up against the like base of the bed, and I woke up with a like startled, and I was like, I think that is what I think it is. It's the pine marten. So anyways, I ended up having to get my friend to kind of come in and help me. We kind of, and it's illegal to entrap a pine marten in Ireland, and to touch them. So like we were kind of like going, oh my god, like it was also, bear in mind, about 5 a.m. in the morning, like, in the middle of Dublin city centre on an August like bank holiday or something like that. And we ended up moving the bed kind of to the side. We got the mattress off. We eventually flipped it up, and then there was loads of stuff under the bed because the girl who I was subletting from, she like just packed all her stuff in and left it under the bed. So it kind of like
nested its way in.
Yeah, weaseled its way into the corner. Exactly. And anyway, we saw it then, and I was like, oh my god. Eventually ended up getting it out, and I chased it out, and it ran down the hall onto the couch and up and out the window. So yes, I have had a very close encounter with a pine marten.
I'd count yourself pretty lucky.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, like, pine martens, they're not easy found. And I mean, now there's a huge initiative to get them back because they're the natural predator of the grey squirrel. And like in Ireland, there's parts of Dublin that literally only like 40 years ago, St. Anne's Park is a famous example. St. Anne's Park was full of red squirrels. Like you could just get the bus or drive or walk, whatever, from the city centre and see nearly guaranteed red squirrels in St. Anne's Park. Within 30 years, the grey squirrels had completely taken over. So pine martens will prey upon grey squirrels, but they can't quite catch the red squirrel for the most part. So you can see if you look up like red squirrel populations now, they're kind of spreading from the west into the Midlands. And if you look at pine marten populations, they're always just that little bit ahead because they're kind of moving out, eating all the grey squirrels, and then the red squirrels can just move on in. So they're actually they're really cool animals, really, really cool.
So they're kind of like a little bit of a gang together, like taking down the grey squirrels.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's mad because I actually I've never seen a red squirrel in Ireland, but I've seen one in Spain actually a good few times. I go into the park, I can see them, and I always kind of thought that there were no red squirrels at all left in Ireland. That was kind of the thing that was told to me. So I'm happy to hear that pine martens and them have teamed up and collab of the year.
Wicklow, you can see a few if you're in Dublin. Even there's parts of Dublin, the likes of Glenasmall, and there's red squirrels there, but they are, they're not what they used to be. They're quite rare in the east of the country now. Wow,
yeah. So there's no red squirrels going through all the forestry from Galway to Dublin or anything like that.
Yeah.
They have to get the Irish rail train now.
Locally.
So the pine marten was in the roof. Now, is that in the middle? This was Tara Street, Dublin City. Like, is that a bit unusual?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It's something I talk a lot about in my job. So I work as a nature educator, and I'm in an area of nature that is within an urban area. And there's this kind of idea that the only place that nature can survive is out, kind of away from us, out, away from urban centers. And that's it's not the case. There's ways that we can develop the urban space to be in favor of nature. Bats are a really good example of something that's really good at, kind of making do with what's around it. So whenever you go out to a local park at night during the summer, or even any greenways that follow little streams through villages, or any sort of green space, you'll more than likely see bats flying overhead. Then you might turn around, and at the bottom of the lane, you'll see a fox crossing over. If you look down in the forest that's just to your right, you might see a little hedgehog. Like, nature can kind of adapt. I mean, that pine marten was probably very happy living in the roof of someone's house.
Oh, he
There's
was.
heat, there's probably stuff for it to prey upon. There's, everything that it needs. And when it's given the space, nature can really, it can thrive in those types of areas. Now, of course, you need those big open forests and those big grasslands and stuff like that. But just because we have to live somewhere, it doesn't mean that the rest of nature can't.
They're kind of being forced to do that. You know what I mean? This pine marten probably delighted not having to pay rent in Dublin too. Like, do you know
Yeah,
what
I
I
know
mean?
he's after land on his feet.
He's a happy out. Like, comes in for a few mandarins now and again, uses the toilet, off he pops. But yeah, that was I got the main thing I couldn't believe them, the length of the nails, the claws.
Mm.
Oh,
Yeah, because
terrifying.
they're a climbing species. They're like
Ah,
semi-arboreal, so that's how they can catch the squirrels. They're like just as able to climb up trees, go out to the end branches, leap and
mm,
bound, and they're cool animals. They're
wow.
very cute.
Do you know one thing I've never seen in Ireland is a badger? Are they very difficult to spot?
Very recently, I've gotten completely obsessed with badgers. So this is
Really?
I'm all up for this topic. So they're hard to spot because they're 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 the largest kind of carnivore in Ireland, which makes them very special to me because we don't have the things that are on the kind of the continent anymore. We don't have
Mm.
lynx or wolves or bears or anything like that. Like, in reality, the badger is the fiercest creature on Irish soil, which is very interesting. But they require a lot of space because of that size. So in the wild, a badger will have a kind of a hunting area of like usually over 300 acres. And actually, so the one thing that I love about them is that they're very social. So you'll have badger families, and say you have your mom badger, your dad badger, and two badger kids, nuclear badger family. Within their 300 odd acres of expanse, there might be another family that are in there, and they will meet each other for summer holidays. And when mam badger and dad badger get a little bit too old and the two kid badgers take over the house, they will go to meet the kids that they grew up with, because the houses are passed down generation to generation. They're like, there's books and documentaries. There's a book called, I think it's called Badgerlands. It's fantastic. It's all like the social structure and the way that badgers work is so interesting. But they are one of those animals that they need that expanse. And unfortunately, in Ireland especially, they are a protected species, but they are weird because have this connotation with BTB, bovine tuberculosis. So they're prosecuted quite heavily by farmers. I don't know what the correct solution is. It's not an area of expertise of mine, but they are culled quite extensively. So it's unfortunate. They're such a beautiful animal. They're so social. They act like little puppies, but I don't think you're really going to see one on Tara Street now.
No, no badgers on Dublin 2 just yet. I didn't realise they required such an expanse, but that makes sense why you probably wouldn't see them. Would Ireland struggle then to provide the space for them almost? Obviously, we've got a lot of like countryside, but they need to be out in like Donegal and Kerry and Connemara and stuff like that.
You'd be surprised. Like, even larger parks within Dublin, they'll supply the space that's needed. It comes back to, as with a lot of things in the kind of nature space, it always comes back to habitat. A badger could have 400 acres of space, but if all of it is industrialized agricultural grassland, there's not going to be the cover that it needs to feel safe. There's not going to be the insects that it needs to eat. There's not going to be the proper space for them to create their homes. You know what I mean? Like, it's all
Mm.
comes down to habitat, and there is the space here. There's no doubt about it. There is areas where they are thriving, and it tends to be in areas that have kind of this old growth forestry or protected areas. The only animal that I would say has the right argument of Ireland doesn't have the space for it at the moment is probably the wolf. I know a lot of people want the reintroduction of the wolf. At the moment, there just is not the wild expanse required for them. But I think every other animal that is native to Ireland has plenty of space. It's just about us creating the habitats that's correct for them.
So, in saying that, would you like to see the introduction of bears to Ireland?
I do think that it would be great to see an apex predator brought back into Ireland. I mean, the main problem facing Irish nature at the moment, specifically in forestry, really is the deer population. There's just there's they have free run of the place essentially. There's no predator for the deer other than hunters. I wouldn't see wolves coming back or bears in our lifetime. And to be honest, if I was going for my lovely hike in the Wicklow Mountains and I came across a wolf, I would be incredibly afraid. So I know it would be hypocritical for me to say like, oh yeah, bring them back and just throw them in. But something like the lynx, it has a questionable past of how native it is to Ireland. There have been archaeological finds of lynx bones, but they're few and far between. I think there may only be one, to be honest. I think it's the same with beavers. But there's no question that there was definitely wolves. There was definitely bears. Whether I would like to see them on my morning hike, I don't know. But it's unquestionable that they would have a positive impact for nature. That's without a doubt.
That's true. I would be the same as you. I'd be a bit wary. Like, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you've been like hiking in a country where they do have wolves or they do have bears. And I think when you're Irish, you're so not used to having that thought in your head. But when it does cross your mind, you're kind of going, oh, Jesus, I would have no idea how to handle that situation. Because I know in America, they really get taught about if you do come across a bear, this is what you should do. I mean, I know I do all the wrong things. It's a bit terrifying.
But the interesting thing is exactly what you were saying is why they are a benefit. So there's a term called ecology of fear, and it's basically like take the deer in Phoenix Park. Like they have to advertise online, please don't pet the deer, please don't feed them. That's the deer have become so accustomed to people that they actually have no fear. They might run away if you like sprint at them, but if you walk over and you have a few, I don't know, porridge oats or something in your hand, they're going to eat them off your hand nearly. You shouldn't do that. There's a billion and one reasons why you shouldn't, so don't. But if you're in the Wicklow Mountains, again, you could be hiking around and you see a herd of deer and you can get very, very close to them because they have no predator. You look at, it's always like, I sound like the most cliche environmental person at the moment, but Yellowstone National Park reintroduced their wolves and it's one of the most successful reintroduction schemes of all time. They changed the course of a river through the introduction of wolves, which sounds a bit like counterintuitive, but through ecology of fear, the deer stopped grazing for these. They would basically just find a spot and they'd sit there for like 2 or 3 hours because why wouldn't they? And they would eat everything in sight. Once the wolves were reintroduced, they started thinking exactly how you did. Like, I don't know how I'd handle if there's a wolf here. I'm a little bit scared that there could be a wolf here. I'm just going to eat a little bit and then I'll move on to the next place. So that ecology of fear is the exact reason why these kind of like what are called keystone species, the likes of bear and wolves and lions and tigers and these large carnivores from around the world, it's why they're so important.
That's fascinating. I never heard of that term before. But in terms of Ireland's biodiversity, how do we compare to our European counterparts?
Not great. A part of that is definitely to do with the fact that we are a smaller island. So we don't have first off the connectedness. It's not like a bear could roam across from northern Spain or something like that. We don't have that. So anything that was on the island once the sea levels rose, that's what's here now, other than the invasive plants and stuff we've brought over. As far as our biodiversity, it's something I've talked about in the past on both my podcast, on TikTok. Whenever someone gives me the time to speak about nature to them, we love to project this very green image, the Emerald Isle and the Wild Atlantic Way, and all of these types of things. In reality, they are a very good marketing campaign that hides what is really there, which is, as I said, like 11% forestry, but less than 1% of that is native broadleaf. Our peatlands are some of the most degraded around, even though we should have some of the best examples of it. Our grasslands, which would have been previously maintained by large herbivores, whether wild or agricultural, are now just wide expanses of the same species of Poa annua grass, just as far as the eye can see. we're not doing too great. Of course, there's still great things that are happening. There's small scale rewilding initiatives that are happening that are showing real promise. We don't really have something to the scale of the likes of the Nep estate in the UK, where they're having, full on like species coming back to areas and stuff like that. But there is kind of hope. And I do think that in the last 2 or 3 years, the general interest in saving the environment has like skyrocketed. And actually, at the moment, I'm listening to David Attenborough's audiobook because it is the big assignment season in college. And so listening to David Attenborough talk about nature, I thought was going to be a lovely, relaxing experience. He talks a lot about, though, how until people see and visualize the state that nature is in, he used the example of the blue whales when they were being used as a resource in the past for oils and stuff like that, and hunted in huge numbers using exploding spearheads. It was an album of blue whale songs that made people really care about the whale. And when that album came out, within a few months, or I believe a year, they had banned the hunting of whales. I think the longer Ireland keeps on putting out this image of the Emerald Isle and look at how great we are for the wilderness, and we're just a beautiful kind of country out to the edge of the Atlantic, the less people are going to realize that we are in a bit of trouble, and the less people are wanting to do something about it.
Yeah, I'm curious though, because in the general election, the Greens lost most of their seats. So I'm going, do Irish people actually care about the environment? I'm very concerned. Why do you think that happened? Do you think that's a reflection, or do you think the Greens in Ireland, I don't know, maybe then they're not focused on the right things?
Yeah, I do think that there's a lot of people who would say, I'm a bit more worried about if I can afford my groceries next week than if the corn crake has a habitat. And I do understand that. I get it. I think that the election was a showing of a lot of things in combination, and maybe not just a reflection of Ireland's view to the environment. I will say that the Green Party, although I believe that there's a lot of people within that party who definitely have nature at the forefront of their mind and really want this sustainable future where we value the biodiversity that we have and we try and improve it. I do think that it's something that maybe people don't see the value of it yet. You look at farming, and a lot of people feel very hard done by in the transition. There's a term, just transition, making sure that as we kind of build towards a future that's better for the environment, better for nature, better for the planet, it's also better for the people most affected. If we just say that we're going to reduce the national herd, and there's no step-by-step process for how we'll make sure that doesn't negatively affect the person who's barely getting by on a dairy farm, then you've got a problem. A lot of environmentalism, there's definitely a thing of it's a lot easier to say than to do. There's a lot of people who will talk a lot about nature and talk a lot about how we need to protect the environment, but maybe they're not as hands on the ground as they kind of wish they were. I think that's changing. I think you see the likes of the Pocket Forest by Catherine Cleary, the Stepping Stone Forest by John Kibbard. There's initiatives in almost every locality across the country. And even if people aren't going out and voting for the likes of the Green Party, I think people are kind of voting with their actions now. They're trying to actually get involved and make the difference that they can visibly see, which you could argue, maybe it's a bit more impactful.
True environmentalism it's changing habits, which is a very difficult thing to do. It's great to see the deposit return scheme, for example. I think that's quite a good positive. It's very common in other countries in the EU, and it was kind of almost like, why are we doing this in Ireland? And I'm like, we actually used to have this in like the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
Like it's
my dad was telling me about it.
Yeah, literally. I'm like, it kind of makes sense.
And it's worked because I've had someone I mentioned just there, John Kibbard from Stepping Stone Forests. He also has a group in Tala called Litter Mugs, and they're a group that go out collecting litter in different areas, but I think mainly in the Sean Walsh Park just outside Tala Village. And he was saying that once the deposit return scheme came in, they just stopped picking up bottles. They just weren't there anymore.
Wow.
And whether that was because people weren't throwing them out to bring them home and to use them themselves, or if it was people collecting them up and getting the return back, from someone else's litter. Regardless, it's less litter on the ground. So I mean, if you can dig down into it and say like, oh, it does this, that, and third, but if it stopped litter, it stopped litter.
Yeah, it stopped litter, and gets us to reuse more plastics, then
Happy days.
it's a good thing. Yeah, exactly. Ireland, as you mentioned, you talked about in the sense of like we're a green place, the wild Atlantic way, the Burren, all this kind of stuff. Do you think that our relationship with the outdoors as Irish people has changed? Where do you see that going? Do you think we're a bit ashamed, or maybe we are a bit uncomfortable with our innate connection to nature?
Absolutely. I've done a lot of thinking about it actually, because no matter what kind of expression form you look at, if you look at Irish art and expression throughout the years, and you get past the kind of the oppression side of it, which is of course very important, but nearly everything is based on landscape, on animals. Like look at your place names. Pretty much everywhere, it's either going to be related to the plant that was prevalent there, the animal that was prevalent there, a myth that was more than likely about a plant, animal, or the landscape in general. I think Ireland has this innate connection with landscape. I think it's why we push that green image, because it is the thing that we're really proud of. And I think there was an element of shame that was brought into it with the Celtic Tiger. I think a lot of people went away from the land, this kind of want to be modern and to be up there with the big boys in the UK or the US or China or whatever it was. We kind of rejected the landscape to turn away from it and go to our urban centers. Go to our, I'm not insulting it, but go to an office job instead of a job that's out on the land. And of course, there are obvious pros to that, but I do think that there's this. I mean, you've talked about it plenty. This kind of second Gaelic revival, and that's not just about arts and about language. That is about landscape primarily. Yeah. The Irish language is so impacted by the landscape and vice versa. I have this obsession with old maps. I love finding old maps and collecting them. And one thing that I got fascinated with was trying to translate the names of my little townships and rivers and all in my local area. I'd say if I made an Excel spreadsheet, probably 70% of them are influenced by the animal that was there or the plant that was there. And then a man from my locality brought out a book, and I was reading through it, and he had a little section that was just about the Irish words that were exclusive to my area, these kind of colloquial terms. And it was something I never thought about, because in my head, Irish is just, it's the language you learn in school and it's set in stone. It's what's in the book. But of course it wasn't that. There was slang terms and local lingo and everything like that. And most of the words that were local to my area were specifically about the landscape, whether that be for farmers or for navigation or whatever it was. The land was the thing that you went by. So I think in this kind of second Gaelic revival, you see people like Bobo the Bard, who's reconnecting with the landscape by going to these sacred places. You see a lot more interest in even something as simple as hiking. Like people just want to get outside now. And you see the likes of Monk and Mangan and his books that explore how the Irish language has affected the landscape and vice versa.
Place names is definitely perhaps one of many ways where we see that reflected. Whenever I think about the land in Ireland or being outside in the land, I always go and I think about the weather, because sometimes the weather makes it a little bit difficult. And I'm thinking now we've got all this technology, whether it be, waterproof jackets and steel-toed boots and all that kind of stuff that can get us through this landscape. How come our ancestors were so able to connect with it and understand it more? Like, surely we should be able to do that now.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting is my online presence, I go by Soil Boy, but the page name is Feet on the Soil. And of course, that has to do with nature. But the reason that it's called that is because when I started the page, it was all about barefoot running, which is something I did for a good while. And through that, the concept of grounding and like connectedness to the outdoors was something that's like very prevalent in that community. So I was trying different things. I had that same thought. I was always fascinated by how did we find out that certain things were edible and certain things weren't, and more to that, how did we find out that there was ways to take the things that weren't edible, process them. And like my favorite thing is the elderberry. You can't eat an elderberry straight off the tree. It won't kill you, but it'll, your stomach won't be feeling too great after. But if you boil them and you make a syrup out of them, you've got essentially a medicine. So you've taken something that would have caused you illness, and then you've turned it into a medicine. And the way in my head that I'm like, so how did someone figure that out? It just fascinates me. I think that there was this connection. I think you can feel it sometimes. I think especially in those areas we were talking about earlier, whether it be the kind of thin spaces of the kind of the beautiful places that Bobo is going out to, or it be just one of these older areas of forestry in your area. If you go out to them and you know, take the headphones off, kind of unplug yourself from the hubbub of the craziness of modern day life, I think you can kind of tap into it a little bit. I don't think you're going to be able to, you know, straight away get this full, you know, experience of what it was like to be alone in the landscape. But I think, like you said, there's 7 or 8 layers of distraction between us and being connected with the outdoors. Every time you make an attempt, you start chipping away at it a little bit. I'm definitely like very early on in that sort of journey, but the more I do it, the more I kind of try and feel that connection to landscape, the more I can understand where the stories came from and how the knowledge got there. It's a pretty cool experience that I'm just kind of getting into.
Very exciting journey ahead of you. I'm very curious that you said it started off with barefoot running.
Mm.
How was that in Ireland? Like, were you kind of running through forests, or what were you?
Yeah, I mean, it was a mix of everything. It's I was using the kind of the funny shoes, the shoes that have like the toes.
Oh no, not those.
I know. They were very glamorous, and as you mentioned in the intro, I've grown up in the Dublin Mountains, so I'm very lucky in that 20 minutes from my house one way is Tala Village. 20 minutes from my house the other way, you're at the Buonabrina Reservoir, which is like you could be like in Connemara or something. It's just the most beautiful place in the world. So a lot of my running was out on the trails, out in the mountains. And it took me a while to realize, but I started to realize that I still love running, and I definitely don't do it as much as I used to, but I do enjoy it. But I was using running as like an excuse to get outside. And you can go through my Strava, and you can start to see that my times, instead of getting faster, got rapidly slower, because I kept on stopping because I would see a bird and get really interested in it, or off out the corner of my eye I could see a mushroom that I hadn't seen in that place before. The barefoot running was interesting because it gets you to that place of connection a little bit more. You've obviously not got a big thick sole of rubber underneath your foot, so by every definition you are more connected to the earth. But it helps you kind of feel that the ancestor 800, 900 years ago was still the same anatomic human that you are now. It's interesting to kind of connect back to that. And I always found that when I was out running barefoot like that, I felt a little bit more in tune with the world around me. And things happened, like animals would kind of appear, and you know, you'd have very cool experiences that, you know, they don't need to be explained. They were just cool because they happened.
What kind of experiences are you referring to?
It sounds like weird. I used to follow animals. And so when I was out running, if there was a buzzard that was flying over, that was a particular one. I used to feel a real like connection with the buzzard. So I used to follow them and try and track where they were going. And you'd end up like in locations that, even though I've grown up there all my life, I maybe hadn't seen. Or I woke up one morning and I had just this urge to run up. There's a hill beside my house called Seahan, and the valley that I live in is called Glenasmall. It's in the stories. It's where Fionn McCool and his gang of lads used to go hunting for boars, and the hill right next to Seahan is called Sea Fin, which is seat of Finn. So it's where he used to sit and have his feast. But I had this just burning urge to run up Seahan, and I left the house with my funny little toe shoes, and I was coming up the hill, and it comes up through a Sitka spruce plantation, so it was quite creepy, and like I'd be lying if I said that I didn't feel a little bit scared when I was coming up. And I stopped at this little viewpoint looking out over Baltinglass, and as I turned around, there was like a deer right behind me, like about 10 paces, just looking back at me. And then it just didn't run off, it just kind of trotted up the hill. And so I was like, okay, that's obviously the way that I'm supposed to go. And so I was kind of pottering behind it. And it continued in front of me up until the very last second, where it like darted off to the left. And then in front of me was like just the clear path to the top of the hill. And on top of the hill, there's an old tomb. I think it's 2500, 3000 BC. And when I sat up there, I was like, oh, that deer was obviously guiding me to be up here.
When you were saying that, I kind of got like shivers. I think maybe it was Tiknock I was going up before and I was doing sunrise. It was like basically pitch black at this point still. Literally turned to my right and there was two deer. I think their eyes jumped out at you, but they were so close. I would say 2 meters away kind of thing. I was like, oh my God, it gave me such a fright. It's interesting that you mentioned the buzzards because when I walked the northern route of the Camino de Santiago, I kept seeing buzzards. So I had this app, I'm sure you're aware of it, Merlin Bird ID. Oh, such a fan.
I love Merlin. Yeah.
So good. So I was always using that whenever I would hear a bird because I wouldn't really know these things. I'd need to look it up, but it does teach you after a while. And I was just like, there's so many buzzards. It's obviously because they're common. I could see them almost fighting in the air with each other, like over territory and stuff.
They're beautiful. They're unbelievable.
It was an amazing experience because I was like, I'm here by myself and they're just up there. You were saying about running. I would do that as well. I love running, but I kind of almost do it. I'm going to go for a long run and it's because I want to actually be outside for a long time.
Yeah.
It's an excuse. I'd be happy to go for a walk as well, but sometimes it seems like I'm going to cover more ground or something, you know?
I have a theory that it's just the more like adult thing to do. Because I would say I enjoy hiking, but what's the difference between hiking and just wanting to go explore? If you say, oh, I went exploring this weekend when you come into work on Monday, it sounds like you're a child. But if you say, oh, I went for a hike, it's cool. And then Strava as well, it gives us this it's like LinkedIn, you know, it's like you can show off that you did this thing. I think if people were a little bit more willing to kind of accept the fact that they just want to explore, I think the thing we were talking about earlier of like that connection, I think you would find that a lot easier. I think that's a big part.
That's really interesting that you bring up exploring like that because everyone's so happy with saying, oh, I what did you do this weekend? Oh, I explored the city. Like say if you go to a new place, you say, oh, we explored the city for the first day. But you won't say like, oh, I explored my local area.
No.
People be like, what's wrong with you? Like,
yeah. And I think things like the Merlin app or there's countless apps out there where you can take a picture of a plant and it will ID them. I have a lot of people who will reach out to me online and ask me where I've learned about things or how they can start. I think one of the best ways, honestly, is that, like, whether it be having the app on your phone or even better, if you can buy like plant ID books or bird identification books and just get outside. And, you know, it's the outro to my podcast, try and get outside today. But like, there is genuinely like no better way to not only learn, but to have like a positive learning experience. Like I'm in college for this stuff and I adore it. But even sometimes I, you know, have to wake up at 10 to 6 in the morning to get a bus into the middle of the town center to learn about nature. And I am a bit like, oh God, like this is a bit of a drag. But if I'm outside and I have my binoculars around my neck and I'm tracking a songbird through a hedge and then really quickly trying to figure out what it is, that's just a beautiful experience and you're learning. So it's a fairly consistent thing where I'll get comments or something about that. If that's always my recommendation, you know, just try and get outside, and whether you've got a guidebook or just your instincts, just enjoy it.
There's no better way to learn than to be in the moment doing the thing, you know.
Exactly.
Learn through doing it. And the great thing about nature is that it's going to be like a sensory experience.
Yeah.
So like whether you're seeing something or you're hearing a bird or you're smelling a plant, like it probably stays with you a little bit longer just because you are so engaged with it from whatever senses, you know.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I want to ask you about hedgerows, Soil Boy, because I believe you're a little bit obsessed with them. Why would anyone want to be obsessed with a hedge?
It's I suppose the ongoing theme of the conversation so far. It's all about habitats. Hedgerows are this very interesting thing because they're essentially a completely man-made habitat. The likelihood of a hedgerow existing in a completely natural world is nearly zero. But you've got these long-established, almost highways for nature. Hedgerows, if anybody's unaware, hedgerow is just another name for hedge, but it usually refers to hedges around the edges of fields that are made of a very varied amount of trees. So it's not like the hedge that might be in the front of some new housing estates or in front of homes where it's single species. It's everything from hawthorns to oak, hazel, blackthorn. You have smaller species like dog rose, elder, like all sorts. They're incredibly biodiverse, which means that you're getting food for a huge amount of different animals. Like the berries of the ivy super important at kind of this time of year. They kind of hold over a lot of birds and smaller mammals, but the rose hips off the rose, the pollen off the huge amount of flowers that come out, the honeydew or honeysuckle is great for moths. So, you know, everything kind of congregates around these hedgerows. They also serve as like I said, a highway. So it makes sense for the obvious things, you know, like a hedgehog is going to be able to stay nicely safe from any attacking invaders in a hedgerow. Same with the likes of your fox or your rooftop pine marten. But the other animals that will use it is bats will use them for navigation. They use them as almost like landmarks. Birds will do the same thing. I don't think there's really an animal in the Irish landscape that you could bring up that doesn't benefit from hedgerows. They also help in kind of wider scale issues, so the likes of carbon sequestration. Usually hedgerows are left in place for a long period of time because they delineate land packages. They're usually left in place, which means that the carbon that gets locked up by the trees stays in the soil. That's another problem with the sitka spruce plantations, not to bring them back up and take another dig at them, but because they get cut down so often, any carbon that gets sequestered, when they get burned or whatever happens, that carbon's straight back into the atmosphere. But back to hedgerows. So the main things, you've got your food, your protection, and then your transport. So for animals, these are an essential thing. In Ireland, we have a huge amount of hedgerows. I believe the last time I checked, I think it's 640,000 kilometers of hedgerow just within Ireland. So when you take that into consideration, it doesn't replace the fact that we've kind of cut down most of our forestry, but that's a huge amount of plant growth. And in a lot of more rural areas, you might find hedgerows that have been kind of left. There's a science of hedgerow maintenance, of hedgerow laying. And when they're done like that, they stay as this kind of thick wall of just plant mass. But if they're left alone for a few years, some of the larger species, the like of in the past, your elm and your ash, your oak, they will start to just kind of flourish into full-size trees. And so on the edges of old fields, you can see these beautiful, there's one right beside my house and it's nearly all oak. And it's just a fantastic thing to see. These are essentially, it's almost like inoculating a field with old stock of plants. There's a huge thing of, you know, you've biodiversity and then you have genetic diversity within biodiversity. So every tree, just like every person, is that little bit different. And the more we have, the more protection that there are to things like plant diseases or pests. So having these almost banks of old growth of hawthorn, blackthorn, oak, ash, elm, the likelihood is, with the amount of plants that are being imported and exported, a disease is going to present itself at some point. The more diversity we have in the kind of the gene pool means that we have a chance of resistance. We're seeing it at the moment with hawthorn, actually. Fire blight is in Ireland and it's causing a lot of damage to hawthorns. We've seen it in the past with Dutch elm disease, which has nearly wiped every elm off the island of Ireland. We've seen it with ash dieback, which is doing the exact same thing to the ash tree. The interesting thing is that all three of those trees have a huge cultural importance in Ireland, and hedgerows might be the answer to kind of keeping those things alive. So I just love them.
When you say cultural importance, I mean, hawthorn are associated oftentimes with sacred sites, stone circles and ring forts and the likes.
Ash would have been highly regarded with the kind of druidic practices as well. So it's another one that's very similar to hawthorn. There's a lot of folklore behind it. If you go back and you look at paintings of the kind of stately homes in Ireland, especially around the 1800s, 1700s, usually they'll have this big dominating tree. 9 times out of 10, that was an elm. They were seen as these kind of like markers of, you know, opulence. But the reason they were seen as that is because of their impressive canopy. They're not quite as good as oak trees in that, you know, oak trees are, I always explain them when I'm giving tours to kids, as oak trees are like apartments for nature. You can have over 1,000 different species on one old oak tree, and that could be anything from, you know, insects, birds, small mammals, fungi, parasites, whatever. Everything is on the oak tree. The wych elm is not as good of an apartment, but it still serves a huge purpose for nature. And these three, the hawthorn, the ash and the elm. Not so much the hawthorn at the moment, but the ash and the elm serve as like the kind of, that should scare you, you know. They're nearly wiped off, and it could happen to any tree, but the genetic diversity that's held in hedgerows, and also just their importance to nature, just, you know, it can't be underestimated. And also they're great for foraging. If you've never started foraging, if ever you were a kid and you walked along and you picked blackberries off the bush and ate them, then you've had an interaction with a hedgerow. So they are a lot of people's first introduction to nature, which I think has its own importance.
I think blackberry picking a huge part of my childhood. Because you mentioned foraging there, I was going to ask you about seasons and kind of maybe working with the seasons a little bit in Ireland. Are there any recommendations that you would give in relation to using the seasons to your advantage?
This is something that has tied in with that thing I was talking about earlier of trying to like break down those degrees of separation in between us and nature. At the moment, as I said, I'm in the very busy season of college, and work is ramping up, and it kind of feels wrong to my body, because winter is supposed to be this time of rest, but also kind of preparing for the busyness of the summer. Lately, I've really been trying to listen to myself and listen to the land and listen to nature and its kind of like recommendations. So I've talked about it in the past, but things like yearly routines have become a big thing for me. So the autumn always seems to kind of creep up on me, and all of a sudden then it's finished, and it's my favorite season. So I want to make it last as long as possible. So I very consciously try and get out and forage for the elderberry. It's one of my favorite plants, and I love the flavor of elderberry syrup. So it's something that I do every year now. And when it gets to spring, there's a few things that I love doing. I mean, the first one is just to try and get out and to see that transition from winter to summer. I think spring is like this lovely period of time where you can still go out and wear your nice kind of cozy coat and feel really like wrapped up outside, but also you can start to see the first flowers come out, the bluebells coming out, the smell of wild garlic in the woodlands. Remind yourself that every animal in the world responds to seasons, whether it be animals that hibernate to try and conserve energy in the winter and then they gorge in the summer, or whatever it is. They're innately connected to the transition of time. And I think we think as big, cool humans that we can get past that. And I think the more that we realize that we can't really, the more we'll find ourselves a little bit happier in ourselves. The one that I always kind of recommend as a starting thing is to do that little bit of foraging in autumn. I think foraging in general gives you an appreciation of nature that like cannot be compared to. As I said, I do nature education work, and one of the things that I do is tours with kids on a farm, and I'd say once a week, if not more, either myself or one of my colleagues will hear a kid have the realization that milk comes from cows and not from SuperValu. They know that milk comes from a cow, but they don't place that as like the cow in front of them gives them the milk that they're then going to drink. You're picking elderberries, you're picking rosehips, you're picking hazelnuts, crab apples, wild cherry, whatever it is. You start to make this association of like, that's nature is going to kind of supply for me. And the seasons kind of tell me what I need, and then nature then gives it.
You mentioned hazelnuts there.
There's a beautiful hazel tree where I work, and I always show it to kids, and I'm like, do you like Nutella? And they're always like, obviously. Like, this tree grows Nutella. And they don't believe me for a second, but then I explain to them, this little nut, this cob nut or hazelnut, when it's roasted and you blend it up and you put a bit of chocolate in, that's what Nutella is. And they're amazed. And like the hazel tree is another one of those ones where there's a real history of magic and connection to the hazel tree. And of course, a lot of that comes from, you know, maybe it was magic. I'm not one to say, but also the hazelnut was just so important as a source of nourishment in the kind of late autumn, early winter, that it just became like magic to us. It was at a time where we needed it, it was supplying. So of course we almost like deified it.
I'll be making mine homemade Nutella. Soil Boy, I'm going to ask you the final question. For you, what does it mean to be Irish?
I've been thinking about it. I really wanted to think about it and to give a good answer. And I was really stumped, but I do think it's what we were talking about earlier. I think it is the connection to the land. And I think that's probably the same for every nation. So I wanted to think about why specifically to Ireland that feels like such a prevalent thought. And I think it was this history of colonialization, and then as soon as we became a state, the kind of the Celtic tiger, like I said, kind of forced us to want to separate from the land. For some reason, through all of that, through like 900 years, we still like revere the land and love it. I don't know why it is. And I think that's the thing that I'm going to spend most of my time trying to explore and learn. But there's this just want to connect with the past and with the land in Ireland that I don't think I've experienced in any other country. Of course, everyone is going to love the country that they're from, but there's something almost deeper. Like there's a love of the soil, of the smallest little things in the landscape, even the things that might negatively affect us. We still love them if they're a part of the landscape. And I think the fact that it's such a, not harsh, but it's such a unique and distinct landscape. It's really captured anybody who has grown up here.
The amount of art that has been created off the back of the Irish landscape.
The thing that's the most incredible about it is that anybody can view that and then be Irish. It's not this exclusive thing of, you know, if your ancestors, you know, tilled this soil since the year whatever, then you get to appreciate it. It's just whoever is here will find a love for it, and then that is to be Irish.
Wonderful. Lovely answer. Thank you so much, Soil Boy. I really love that conversation because maybe this is just because it is intuitive for us to be connected to nature, but I do find the more I learn about it, I really get quite excited.
If you enjoyed hearing me ramble on about a variety of things, then you might enjoy my podcast, Feet on the Soil. And if you've anything that you wish to correct me on or to have a chat with me, you can find me on Feet on the Soil on Instagram and TikTok.
Thank you so much, Soil Boy. Right? Mil mahagat.
Thank you for having me. See you now.
Thanks a million for listening to that chat with Soil Boy. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot about biodiversity and nature in Ireland. Can't wait to get out now and have a look at those hedgerows. Who knew hedgerows could be so important? If you enjoyed this episode, send it on to one of your nature-loving friends or indeed somebody who perhaps needs to appreciate it, because connection to the land definitely, as I said, is coming up a lot in this podcast series. And tune in the next week. I think we're going to have a fabulous review of 2024 in Ireland and what were the top news stories. Anyways, I'll leave you go. Gurv mila mila mahagwiv os éisteacht and bear bua.